Okay, PSY213 class, this is lecture 14, Distortions of Memory, and it's going to start with a discussion of false memory. So you should have already done the memory training test, or study and test. That was actually a demonstration that we'll talk about. Actually, what you did is you did a version of this study ROEDIGER and McDermott conducted in 1995. You can find this article actually in Canvas in our supplemental readings if you want to look at it, but I'm going to summarize what they did here. So what they did is they had participants study these things called DEESE lists. DEESE was a researcher who developed these lists, and he would do this as part of a learning experiment in his class. And so, actually, before I go there, so in the first experiment, what they did is they studied the DEESE list. They had a recall followed with a modified recognition. And experiment 2 was much of the same, but they had some control procedures, and then they also had them do remember no judgments. And you might remember this when we were talking about recognition. You give an R response to things that you recollect or remember a specific part of the learning episode, and K is just a sense of familiarity because they wanted people to report on their subjective experiences of the test items. So what are the sample DEESE lists? So you'll notice that these words, you studied the list associated with needle, you studied the list associated with river, and the list associated with sleep. Now it's really important, these are the study words, these are the old words. These words, needle, river, and sleep, were never presented on the study list. However, you may have gone through and identified them, most likely you did, or one or two, or maybe even all three, as words that you studied. These are what are called the critical lures. So the lure is an idea, this is a new word, right? And you want to see if people sort of take the lure. So it's a critical lure because they're all highly associated with these lists, each one. And there's, I think, like 13 or 14 of these DEESE lists that people could study. And so ROEDIGER and McDermott had them study the DEESE lists. Experiment 1, as I mentioned, recall followed with modified recognition. Let's take a look at what they found. And so they did a modified, so they indicated whether it was sure that it was old, probably new, or sure new. So they got a little bit of confidence. As you know, I asked your confidence ratings as well. So let's take a look at what they found. So these are the studied old words, and you can see that 86% of the time people are identifying them as old, and most of the time they're sure that they're old. These are some new words that were totally unrelated to those study lists, and you can see that 98% of the time they are correctly rejecting them, right? They're saying that they're new items. They then put on some weakly related lures, and you can see that the numbers are a little bit better, but still pretty strongly identifying these as new. Well, let's look at the critical lures, and the critical lures are those words like sleep, needle, and you can see that 58% of the time, or this is a proportion, but 58% of the time, they're identifying them as old, and they're saying they're sure it's old. And even when you combine these numbers together, it's pretty close to the numbers up here in terms of their ability to identify them as old. Now, the important thing is these were unstudied items. These are new items. So you're getting lots of false alarms, if you will. These are new items called old, so false alarms or false reports of having remembered this. Now this happens also in recall. They also did a recall test. And, before we move on, and what they also found is that these critical lures were attracting more R responses, right? So people were sort of saying they not only identified them as old, but remember studying those particular old items. So now what I have you guys do is do the same thing. And this is a demonstration I do in my class. And a few years ago, I started having students do the memory training to sort of see how that would affect their memory on this false memory demonstration. So here's the 4 classes that I had before, and here are their performance on this. So this is as you can see, it's pretty similar to what ROEDIGER and McDermott had. So the false old items called old, false alarm. So these would be new items called old, right? Very low false alarm rate. But look at the critical lures, right at where ROEDIGER and McDermott found for identifying them. right? The confidence rating for the critical lures was 8. So it was the same scale that you used, 1 to 10, 1 being not at all confident, 10 being extremely confident. You can see that people are very confident in their critical lure responses here. So they think these items were old. Now, the classes that had the memory training, they did better overall. So they remembered more of the items. False alarm rate is about the same, but they remembered more of the old items. So the memory training was paying off. Look at the critical lures, though. It didn't go down. If anything, it went up. And right now, it's significant. We'll have to see what your class does by adding more people. And you notice the confidence is basically the same here as well. So the memory training does work, does help you remember more, but it doesn't eliminate this false memory effect. So what's happening here in terms of this ROEDIGER-McDermott demonstration here? A couple different explanations. So one explanation is a failure of source monitoring. So how would this happen? That is, you're reading these lists of words that are strongly related. So you're reading bed, rest, all that, and it makes you think of the critical lure, sleep. And so when you encounter the critical lure, sleep, on the recognition test, you can't really distinguish between what you thought about and what you actually saw. And so it's sort of a false memory brought about by a source monitoring failure. Another explanation is a fluency explanation. So fluency refers to the ease of processing. So fluent things are read easily or heard easily. And so in this case, when you see words that are similar to a concept, like the words that are similar to sleep, their concepts can produce what's called conceptual familiarity and prime or increase the fluency of a related word, right? The critical lure, like the word sleep. The problem with this explanation is it doesn't really explain why people were giving more recollective kinds of responses, like more R judgments. That part's not clear. We'll talk about fluency underlying some other distortions of memory, which it's more clear that that could be happening, but it's not producing these strong recollective experiences. So how pervasive are these effects, you might be wondering. So Gallo, Roberts, and SEAMON, what they did is they basically did this DEESE, ROEDIGER-McDermott paradigm, so it's called the DRM paradigm for short. They had 3 groups. One group was informed about the DEESE, ROEDIGER-McDermott effects. Another, so a pretty specific instruction. Another was just told more generally to guard against false alarms, like be careful for identifying new words as old, to encourage people to be pretty conservative. And another one was told to guard against critical lures, like there are specific words that are highly related to these lists. Make sure you don't identify them as old. What they basically found is that some of these instructions reduced the effect, but it didn't eliminate it. So you can't really get rid of it. It's a robust, pretty robust phenomena. This has been replicated many, many times over, and as you can see from our demonstrations in class, it works really well. So what about those people who had highly superior autobiographical memory? Well, Pathis et al., what they did is, that's supposed to be 2013, what they did in their study is that they did the same thing, but they put these HSAM people, excuse me, in the DEESE, ROEDIGER-McDermott paradigm. Panel B here shows you their recognition of the critical lures, and you can see that that doesn't differ from our control subjects, and their proportions are pretty similar to what we found in our studies, right? So false memory rates, same as control subjects. They doesn't differentiate. Now down here, this is overall memory. So overall, the HSAM group is better than the control, but they don't differ in the false memory to the critical lures, right? So again, showing that their memory, these highly superior autobiographical memory people, their memory works just like yours and mine does, but they have a better ability to hold on to information than we do. So this is a nice little laboratory demonstration of a false memory, but that raises the question, can you have a real false memory for an autobiographical event? So Elizabeth Loftus did a number of studies. One sort of affectionately referred to as lost in a shopping mall, and what she did is she took a subject, a 14-year-old boy named Chris, and Chris's family came into Loftus's lab and did a family journal where they were recounting family memories. And one of the memories that they were recounting was a false event where they described Chris being lost in a shopping mall. And after a while, Chris recounted details of having remembered this event. So there's a video that sort of explains this. I'm going to have you watch the video. So pause this video here, watch the sample video describing this experiment, and then we'll wrap it up. All right, so now hopefully you're back. The key thing that I want to get across to you here is that Loftus replicated this several times with different subjects, and it's been even replicated in the lab using simple kinds of actions. So you can have people do things like hang the coat, staple the papers, etc. And then in the laboratory, you know what they have done and what they haven't done. And the bottom line is you can create false claims of having performed these actions by repeated imaginings. So if you repeatedly imagine staple the papers, you'll later claim that you've done it even when you haven't done it. So these are like false memory claims of having done particular actions, but verified in a laboratory. So this is transcended to studies with children, and Stephen Ceci does a lot of false memory, or has done a lot of false memory studies with children, where he was implanting them in children. And they seem to be a little bit more susceptible to false memories. They have a little bit more difficult time source monitoring, and essentially same kind of thing, where if you have them imagine scenarios over several days, they start to have false memories. A couple of examples of this: they have the children subjects were in a classroom, and they had a visit by a clown by the name of Sam Stone. And Sam Stone came in, and he was kind of a clumsy. He stumbled around, messed up some things in the classroom, and the kids were later asked about who created all of these things in the classroom, and the kids sort of blamed Sam Stone, even though the researchers knew what he had done and what he hadn't done. Stephen Ceci also wanted to implant some implausible memories, and so the children engaged in some imagination about taking a plane ride with an alligator, which of course couldn't happen, but later children would recount a detailed story about going on the plane ride with an alligator. So it's really, bottom line here from this research is that children were more susceptible to false memories. Now, can you have implausible false memories in adults? And the answer is yes. And so in this other paper that Loftus and her colleagues, what they did is they had people study an ad about Disney World, and then they just sort of questioned them about it and looked at their false recollections. So I have another video. I want you to pause this video here, watch that video, and then come back to it, and they'll take you through and talk about how people had some false memories that were implausible. Another example of an implausible false memory from Loftus and her colleagues as well is what they did is they took historical photographs. So this is a historical photograph of 1989. Chinese students were protesting for more freedom, and the government sent some tanks to dispel the protesters in Tiananmen Square. And so this one first photograph at the top is a world-famous photograph where you have this Chinese student here standing in front of a line of tanks here. Now what they did is they took that photograph and they doctored it. They put people in it. And then they questioned people about their recollections of the event. Were there people? Were there no people? And of course, people who saw the doctored photographs with people in it were much more likely to say, yeah, there were people around. So what's going on here in all of this work, just to sort of recap what's going on, if you have repeated imaginings of anything, you eventually can become to believe that you've actually done it. So the common explanation for this is that each time you imagine something or listen to a suggestion, or maybe you see a doctored photograph, you're going to have more details in your memory, more perceptual details in your memory, and then that makes it easier for you to believe that it really happened, because our imaginings have fewer details overall in our memories. Right, that's the idea. So seeing a doctored photograph or an advertisement going to lead you much more likely to think it's real, even though it wasn't real. So both of these cases, it's really a failure of source monitoring, right? So did you see it in the doctored photograph, or is it really like that in your memory? Did you really meet Bugs Bunny at Disney World, or was it from that recent experience with the ad? This could also be, though, retroactive interference if you're thinking about it, because you sort of have the original event. So think about the Tiananmen Square. Maybe you saw the original event, and now you're seeing a doctored photograph, and what happens is the doctored photograph interferes with your ability to remember it the original way, right? So that would be retroactive interference, right? So either way, that's sort of a common explanation for these false memories. So what we'll do in the next video is come and we'll talk about memory recovery techniques, because some of this has some implication for memory recovery techniques.